So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Conversatory on Racism. Is our we have another one. Today is the one before last. I forgot how you say that in English. I have to say it's my big pleasure to introduce today Professor Karen Umemoto. She's the Director's Chairs of the Asian American Studies Center and an Urban Planning and Asian Study Professor at UCLA. She wrote innumerable articles on democracy and justice in multicultural societies, inclusive urban planning processes, youth studies, criminal justice studies, gender education, pedagogy. She also had books which won many awards. She has also awards for community service, for teaching, and for planning. She's a member of several editorial boards. I want to highlight about Karen is that, yes, she is an urban planner, and she sees infrastructure as both physical and human. And this is something that we're going to explore today. Human infrastructure for a democratic and just society. So it's my big pleasure, Karen, to have you here with us today.
Thank you, Mara. It's an honor to be here with you.
So let me start with discuss, before this conversation, you have an image there as a background. And it's great to have you here to discuss the crimes in Atlanta in order to illuminate issues of wider importance, because even though this came to the attention, in Atlanta and in the past year, these are long dated, issues against Asian American and Pacific Islanders. So would you tell us about this crime and why you have the image that you have in the background?
Sure. As I think we all know, the mass murder in Atlanta, Georgia, of women who worked at the massage parlors really brought to light the issue of anti-Asian racism and violence. But I think that that type of mass incident is a little more of an anomaly than in that most of the anti-Asian hate incidents, which number well over 6,000 over the past year, and those are just the ones that have been reported to the Stop AAPI Hate hotline or online reporting site. It's just kind of the tip of the iceberg. Most of the incidents are kind of the everyday, right? Acts of verbal harassment, shunning, some physical assaults, and some civil rights violations and online harassment. But I think the incident in Atlanta is really important for various reasons. But let me go to this diagram first, because I've been giving a lot of talks on the issue of anti-Asian racism. And one of the things that people feel is a lot of confusion, like, why is this happening? Many people are scared. Many people are telling their parents, not to leave the house, and that's why racist incidents are so powerful, right? Because they terrorize, whole communities and put whole communities in kind of this state of fear, particularly those who have been those communities that have been more impacted. So anyway, I use this the fire triangle, that I learned, I think in 5th grade, when you watch the Smokey the Bear videos. Smokey the Bear is kind of this little iconic animated figure that teaches youth and students like how to prevent forest fires. But anyway, so one of the things that they talk about is what does it take to make a fire? And you could look at this wave of anti-Asian hate incidents as kind of a firestorm of hate. And we've seen this happen in various waves in the past, but it takes fuel, oxygen, and heat. And I was just thinking about this metaphor because, if you think about why this is happening at this time, and not to give an excuse for it, but for us to be able to understand it better, to be able to better address the problem. There's been kind of this kind of historic layers of anti-Asian perceptions of stereotypes of Asians as the perpetual foreigner or the model minority myth, or the model minority, which is a myth, that in very different ways tries to dehumanize, who we are and really, and then you have this pandemic that has caused so much pain and agony for so many people. And then you have all the economic precarity and distress and suffering that people have faced. And then you have this kind of trade war with China, right? That's already put people kind of in a kind of a defensive position towards China and Chinese people, and makes people feel like China is is a threatening kind of menace in terms of our the stability of our own economy and jobs and things like that. Anyway, so you had all of these things that could be considered part of the underbrush. Then you had this kind of event, right, that triggered it. Usually that ignites these fires. And I think in this case, we can empirically see how the use of the term China virus or Chinese virus by Trump really ignited this wave of discourse blaming China and Chinese people for the pandemic and all of the suffering that it's wrought. And then it just traveled, just like the winds fueled the fires in California, through social media, that if empirically you could actually count the numbers of anti-Asian tweets that really escalated after that point. So anyway, I think it's helpful because it helps us think about, okay, how do you clear the brush, right? How do you turn down the temperature? How do you shift the winds in a different direction? So
Yeah, that's a great introduction because it introduces many dimensions to the issue, and it's an excellent entry point. On the one hand, we have, if I understand you correctly, this shadow pandemic, right? Like it's the counterpoint to the pandemic, that points to Chinese or China in a way that is decodified in all sorts of ways, because even the incident with Vincent Chin in 1982, was it? Maybe I have that. He was blamed, or he was slurred with being Japanese, given what happened, in the auto industry with Japan. So we have that, but we also have a long dated history of foreigning, right? Like not only that, but also the perpetual foreigner that you propose in your title, a history of empire, right? And colonized subjects, as well, that you treat in your book. I hope we get to that. But also, I'm laying kind of the groundwork, but also like a racialized structure, right? Like a hierarchical racial structure of the US. So would you tell us a bit about the history of the perpetual foreigners in laws and how that played out?
sure. I mean, I think the unique theme in Asian American history is that Asian Americans were never fully accepted, right, as full and equal members of society in the public imagination, and these various laws and various attitudes and various events and social movements, I think, helped to kind of promote that position, and support that position. So, from the Page Act in the 1870s to the more well-known anti-exclusion law called the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, for example, took place in the midst of this flurry of anti-Asian violence. So, and I think this is one of the first major waves of anti-Asian violence, where there were in Los Angeles in 1871, there was the Chinatown massacre, where 19 people were killed and lynched by white mobs, and that kind of spurred a whole series of massacres in Seattle and Tacoma and other cities where Chinese were working as miners or working in the gold rush as part of the gold rush, or working in some of the expanding industries as westward expansion took place. So there were like over 200 incidents between 1850 and 1900. But the major law that people are familiar with that punctuated that period, that kind of represented that attitude of exclusion, was the Chinese Exclusion Act that forbade Chinese from further immigrating to the U.S. And then they were followed by waves but American industry still needed labor. So then they went to Japan and started contracting labor from Japan. And then there was a 1906 gentleman's agreement that slowed immigration from Japan. But they still needed labor. So, Filipino workers were brought in, and then some Korean workers were brought in, and South Asian workers. So there's this kind of pattern of, we need their labor, so let them in or bring them in. And then we've had enough of them, or there are too many of them. So let's start, kind of hitting the brakes on immigration from that group. But Asian Americans played a key role in helping to develop the plantation industry in Hawaii, the farming industry in California, the gold mines. Chinese built the most difficult, challenging parts of the transcontinental railroad through the Sierra Nevada mountains. Asian Americans helped build the fishing and cannery and produce industries, produce markets. So they were real contributors, but they were never accepted. They couldn't own land. There was a alien land law of 1924. There was and it wasn't even until 1952, the Walter McCarran Act, that they were even eligible for citizenship. And that wasn't long ago. So, and then there were other immigration laws then that favored more educated Asian Americans. So we had much more professional, people from professional backgrounds, or people with a certain amount of capital, coming in. Post 1965. So it's really so that's fueled the model minority myth. So you have on one hand this perpetual foreigner, right? That's been embedded in history through laws and through social movements, a lot of exclusionary movements. And then you have the model minority myth that just looks at some of the people who have achieved economic success and use them to kind of represent everyone, which has been really problematic.
Yeah, I'm gonna leave that for a little bit, further in the conversation. But what I wanted to point out is that what you're saying with all these things is that the immigration of different Asian groups, and we can, expand to Pacific Islanders as well, is intrinsically related with the movements in international political economy and the needs of the market. Right, and they travel around, and also with empire and colonies, and this is how they are incorporated but not integrated, right? But what I want to just ask you, because what I find fascinating about this is that if I understand correctly, one of these law prior to the Chinese Exclusionary Act is the Page Act of 1875, if I have the year correctly, which is prior, and it relates directly, in my understanding, to the crime, to the killings in Atlanta, because it was banning prostitution. So the sexualization of the Asian women had already then a place, in the social imaginary, as you put it, right?
Right. So from the very beginning, Asian women were seen as prostitutes, very one-dimensional images of Asian women, that they were immoral, and they led that they would kind of see this polyamorous kind of social culture in American society. So the Page Act really created this whole policing of immigrants around sexuality, and that kind of was repeated, right? That pattern could be repeated, and that image could be seen in popular culture, in Madame Butterfly and Miss Saigon, and some of the most visible, most popular kind of entertainment venues of that time really presented Asian women as this is kind of exotic features that were kind of hypersexualized in this way that um, created this sense of excess, right? Excess sensuality, and that kind of really objectified women, and was and people were able to then treat women in subservient ways. I remember, and it's funny how these things continue like over time. When I was a high school student, they had those summer intern programs for low income students. And I got one of these kind of federal summer jobs working at the Air Force Medical Center in, I think it was El Segundo. And I was working for a colonel who had been stationed in the Philippines. And he would always yell every morning, coffee. And I had to run and get him coffee. And it was just this, kind of throwback right to this earlier era. And one time he sat me down and told me about how I remind him all the Filipino women he had in the Philippines. And it was just torturous, and I was 16, 17. And I didn't even have the words to be able to speak back to that, and it left, just kind of this memory in my mind. But in retrospect, it reminds me of how is it that these images, right, get um, enacted in everyday life, in the way
Mhm.
that people treat one another, and in the ways that stories are told and retold, right, to the next generation, so that we reproduce these images in society in very harmful and negative ways.
Yeah, and in both ways, because going back to the killings in Atlanta, as an entry point to these issues, there was a temptation, and the women were there to be subjected, and it was like the pure, the poor tempted man who had to be excused, given that, Asian, well, 6 out of 8, but like Asian women were, the provokers. I know you don't say it like that, of temptation, right?
Yeah, I think that's the infuriating thing, right? That's what's so infuriating about the way in which the media talks about it, and especially the discourse about whether or not it's a hate crime or not, right? Because there is a difference between racial violence and a hate crime, but there's been so much of a focus on that case about whether or not it's a hate crime or not. And I don't think that that's been really productive, um, because it's hard to prove a hate crime. You have to have a smoking gun to prove intent, as opposed to looking at the actual outcome of what happened and the explanation of what happened. So, and crimes against Asians are a little different. It's not like someone posts a swastika right on the store, or that somebody says kind of racial epithets that are very common, much more common for other groups, unfortunately. And so if you don't have a smoking gun, then people say it's not a hate crime. But let's talk about whether or not it was an act of racial violence. And I think when we look at that excuse of, oh, it was, he succumbed to the temptation. Well, where does that temptation come from, right? How is temptation constructed, and what are the structures and dynamics that create that situation in the first place? I mean, there is a problem of sex trafficking that's a $2.5 billion industry. Who's
Mhm.
profiting from it? Who's promoting, right? who's promoting that industry. And that's not to say that all massage therapists are sex workers. I mean, but I think the way that it's been constructed, and because of the actual, um, machinations of the industry itself to promote that, because it benefits that industry. I think we have to look at those things as well. And you can't say that it doesn't have to have anything to do with race. It has everything to do with race. And you could trace it to, US wars in the Pacific, and the whole sex industry surrounding military bases as well.
Mm-hmm. As John Oliver always says in Last Week Tonight, there's a lot to unpack in in what you say. And first, I want to make the conceptual difference between the hate crime and an act of racial violence. A hate crime is like when the main motive can be proven, the intention to be hate based on race or gender or sexual orientation. On an act of racial violence is an act that in one of its elements includes, these trigger, if we can put it, or I don't like the word, but let's just put the word, this trigger. And that's much more difficult to prove on an individual case basis, but not if you, and going to the other points that you were making, you look at it in structural ways. Like, what are the elements that are present in this single act that make this act common to all other acts, that are like this. So because, given, I mean, if we go back to your oxygen, heat, and fuel, right? And fuel, I mean, and this shadow pandemic, about the China virus, there was also very incendiary, to follow your metaphor language, in the past, Trump years, about women, right? And how they were objects. So they were kind of these two things juxtaposed. I wanted to ask you, a question about how do Asian Americans, maybe I'm moving a little bit, further, but how do Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders fit into the racial structure or racial hierarchy, of the US? It's very complex. You pointed to the idea of the model minority that I would like to explore later. And on the other hand, there are also, Black and Asian, tensions. We can go back to 1992, with the riots in LA, or even, recent kind of assaults in San Francisco, if I understand correctly. So how do you place, the Asian American and Pacific Islanders, that is already like a huge umbrella concept in this hierarchy?
So Mara, you're asking me to explain race relations in 10 minutes.
I know.
No, it's good. It's a really good question, and really relevant right now, because I think there's always been, even in the scholarly world, right, the treatment of race relations in mainly Black and white terms, and where do Asians, Latinx communities and others like kind of fit into this. And people then talked about the racial hierarchy, that there is a hierarchy, and that some people have argued that Asians are closer to whites, or more proximal to whites, right, in this ladder. But I think that also really overlooks the wide variation in the Asian American experiences and Pacific Islander experiences as well. So, when we talk about Asian Americans, we're talking about people who come from 50 different ethnic groups, who speak over 100 languages, who have come here under many different circumstances at various points in time, and who have concentrated, like, geographically in communities in different parts of the country, due to like specific circumstances, whether or not it's because of refugee resettlement policies or because of exclusionary policies in the, in pre 1965 and even post 1965 when there was, um, de jure segregation. So there are many things that really complicate this. And I think the discussion about intersectionality brings to fore the idea that that it's important to be able to think about the different structures of power and how different systems of power and how different systems of power have differentially, impacted different ethnic, racial, class, religious, gender,
Mhm.
um, and gender, people with different gender orientations and um, sexual orientations. So, uh, so that we could like look at a particular incident in more complex, more comprehensive ways. So I think in this moment of anti-Asian hate, I think we're reminded of the position of Asians as always being this perpetual foreigner, but also this model kind of caught between the perpetual foreigner and the model minority, um, where Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, for example, some have been part of Silicon Valley and who have not necessarily faced the same type of experience as, say, Pacific Islanders, who have one of the highest rates of infection and mortality of any ethnic or racial group in this country under
Mhm.
this pandemic, right?
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
so there's so but at the same time, you have a lot of East Asians in Silicon Valley who have hit the bamboo ceiling, right? And are not represented at all in kind of Fortune 500 boardrooms. So it's not that, people, so we have to, I think, understand the different ways that kind of structures of inequality affect different people in different places at different times and in different parts, uh, who affect people who inhabit different parts of that racial hierarchy. And
Yes,
Asians can't be put in just one, can't be lumped together.
yes, and to that question, I mean, you've done, extensive work on Pacific Islanders, and I was gonna ask you, I asked you about the racial hierarchy because the question is, who are we talking about when we're talking about Asian Americans? And as you were speaking, you were saying Asian Americans and then Asian American Pacific Islanders, pointing to kind of different positioning, right, in society. So I would like to illuminate, this amazing ethnographic work that you have done in Jacked Up and Unjust about, youth violence. Um, Let me read the subtitle because uh, Pacific Islander teens confront violent legacies, right? And in that book, what you point out, I mean, I found fascinating the part about, youth studies and criminal justice. It opens up like many universe, but in particular, so I recommend everyone to read it if you like, kind of ethnographies with theoretical, insight. But what you're illuminating there is like a racialized poverty, a result of colonialism, right? And you call it colonial patriarchy, like these big words. But basically, it was a result of the colonial empire, in the US. And also, mixed up with this other dimension that you mentioned, which is, gender. um, can you tell us a little bit about, this experience, the poverty, the racialization, and, how it does and does not relate to other groups in the Asian American umbrella?
Yeah, no, thank you for that question because I think there's a lot of discussion about the utility and ethics of combining that term AAPI, right, Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, which Asian Americans itself was a political term, right? Before before the 1960s social movements, the term Asian American didn't exist. People were called Orientals, right? But people rejected the term Orientals because it's um, it's relative, right? It's east of Europe versus Occidental. So it was a very Eurocentric term that activists of the 1960s rejected, and then phrased the term Asian Americans because I think during that time, Asian Americans were comprised, largely of Japanese, Chinese, Filipino, Korean, South Asian, and a few the kind of pre 65 immigration groups. And I think there was a lot in common in terms of labor history, in terms of racism and discrimination, and in terms of kind of the kinds of barriers that people were facing. And so I think it was, and the demands that people were asking for at that time, that kind of united people, was around against US imperialism in Asia and elsewhere, and for freedom, freedom and sovereignty for people. And that was a point of solidarity, not just among many Asian American activists at that time, but also with Pacific Islanders, right, who were fighting for sovereignty for the Hawaiian Nation, and US military getting out of other islands in the Pacific, and the kinds of opposition to nuclear testing, in the Marshall Islands, and the kinds of violations, right? I mean, serious harm that the U.S. military was imposing on people. When you read the history of testing of atomic weapons, in the Pacific, it'll just make you cry. And people are still dealing with it today because the land is still poisoned and still toxic. So I think there are very particular histories of colonization that are different from the histories of Asian American immigrants. And those are very important to understand because it's the level, and that's why I'm not surprised that Pacific Islanders had some of the highest rates of mortality, because that's a manifestation, right, of the kind of situation, the degree of inequality that people are facing. And so you have a lot of Pacific Islanders who are still coming in under the Compact of Free Association, for example, where the military is allowing, free mobility between the U.S. Continent, well, between the 50 Western states and the nations under the COFA agreement, for use in exchange for use of their land for military bases and operations. So you have people who come, and you find people working in the meatpacking industry and other industries that are highly impacted, but they're also not eligible for the full benefits, right? Health benefits that American citizens are eligible for. So there's this kind of built-in inequality. So I think it's really important for us and helpful and useful to understand, what are the particularities that different ethnic and national groups face within this kind of complex structure of inequality, that we have in the U.S.
Yeah, because in the book, and it's not that I'm going to give out, the ending of the book, but you talk about this individual positionality, like the individual position of each individual. But interesting enough, what I find most fascinating, it is not just to leave that at the level of individual, but all the contrary, to illuminate in the challenges and navigations of certain individuals all the structural dimensions that are at play and that need to be looked, actually, and unravel and address, with interventions that are going to, modify, the urban and interrelational kind of structure. So, I mean, I think that you were mentioned the term, if I understood correctly, was created by someone in the department like you chair now, right? Like the term Asian American.
Oh yeah, that was coined by Yuji Ishioka and Emma G, and they were at the Asian American Studies Center back in Yuji Ishioka, I think, was quoted as using that term in 1969, but he was at that time at UC Berkeley as part of the Asian American Political Alliance, and that was one of the first organizations that used that term Asian American. But he was very active in in kind of promoting an understanding of what it is that Asians and Asian Americans have in common um, in the um, in the context of U.S. imperialism in Asia, in the context of colonization of the Pacific, in the context of immigration, contract labor, and immigration, and exclusionary patterns in our histories. So, but
oh, sorry.
oh no,
No,
going back to the. Oh no, go ahead. Sorry.
No, that what strikes me, I mean, in this, in this context and in this country, right, is that the civil rights movement was an amazing promise in a lot of ways. It was an amazing promise for, definitely for Blacks, but also for other groups in terms of civil disobedience and making the rights all that the rights, can be. Now, what puzzles me, and we discussed this also with the making of Latinos in the Hispanics on a prior session, and what I'm hearing from you is that even though that was a huge moment of potential kind of like transversality, right? Like building solidarities, lasting solidarities among groups on dimensions that were not racialized, and that's what they were fighting against in a way. This is the way it came out, in a way that it has not proved to be, but turned out to be a very much zero sum game, right? It's like pitting groups against each other. And this is where the idea of the model minority comes, and it's being used precisely, I'm going to say from the right, for lack of, better terminology, to say, you see, if you work enough and you're like a, morally, it's based on, individual morality, you can make it. There's no discrimination, no structure, like you can do it. So
Right. And it really puts a wedge. It's used as a wedge between different racial groups. So, for example, the whole battle around affirmative action. There are, Asian Americans fought for affirmative action in the 1960s. So the San Francisco state strike and other strikes that followed, and student protests that set up ethnic studies and affirmative action kind of in one fell swoop, was united, was really a movement of solidarity between Black, brown, yellow, red, as they said in those times, for an open and accessible education for all, and for us to be able to see ourselves, right, in the history books, and to be able to have our stories included in the narratives about the history of this country, as well as to be able to play more leadership roles, right, in all the institutions, including, serving as faculty and being able to enter that pipeline into academia and other areas. So it was a movement based on solidarity, but solidarity based on a common vision, right, of a future, a more just, democratic, inclusive future. And not only that, based on the idea of self-determination for all nations, right, as
Uh-huh.
well as all peoples, and the right to practice one's cultural traditions, heritages, languages, um, and be able to kind of preserve, different knowledge systems that exist in the world and that people bring to this country. So um, I think that whole that vision and to be able to and there was a strong element of that people wanted a society that wasn't based on labor exploitation, right, and colonization
Mm-hmm.
and exploitation,
Mm-hmm.
and it was an experimental time where people were trying to figure out, okay, how do we live those kinds of values in our everyday life. um, and I think there was a lot of repression against that. All the civil rights uh, leaders were, the major ones were assassinated, from King to Malcolm X to Huey Newton to Fred Hampton to, and then others were charged and some jailed. And it was really a very sad time, right? The response to the civil rights movement, the free speech movement, the Black Power movement, the women's movement, um, but particularly the Black Power movement and civil rights movement it was such a strong physical, right, repressive response on the part of government and segregationist groups, and and things. Um, there are many different um, efforts, right, that where people try to work together, in solidarity, and there's so many different examples of that, but they're not lifted, right,
Mm-hmm.
in ways that people can recognize them. And in fact, what's been focused on are things like Black Korean tensions in South Central LA, leading up to, say, the Rodney King
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
beating and the civil unrest. But people talk about Black Korean tensions in that way, right? In that situation, that that pays no attention to like the structural basis, right, of these tensions. So, for example, a lot of the tensions were between Korean liquor store owners and Black residents, right, in
Mm-hmm.
South Central, and people feeling resentful that they're not residents weren't being treated respectfully. And then there was that incident between in the killing of Latasha Harlins by Soon Ja-do, who was a um, one of the wife of liquor store owner. One of and so um, I think one of the things that people didn't talk about during that time was the liquor store licensing rules and regulations and policies, right? So I'm a planner and I look at these policies and I think, okay, the state of California issues these liquor licenses, and that you buy them, but you sell them with a quota so that they're not concentrated in certain neighborhoods. So you could only sell so many to certain people. I mean, in certain zip code areas or certain jurisdictions. But after that, you could sell them across jurisdictions. So that law that tried to prevent the concentration of liquor stores, was really nullified. Um, and so you did have this high concentration, and then you just had this turnover from Jewish owners to Korean owners, right, for various reasons during that time. And you had a period of, you had food deserts where other people were not investing in the community. There was redlining. It was hard to get loans to set up businesses in that community. And it was still hard for Black residents to even buy the homes they were renting, right, because of
Mm-hmm.
redlining. So there are all these also structural things that end up pitting groups against each other. And I I'm not condoning at all Sunjadu's, the murder. Um, but if you But if I think, and I think there are resentments that still linger from that time that you could see in some of the social media posts within the Black Lives Matter. You know what I mean? Within this age of Black Lives Matter. So things are not forgotten, but I think there is need for greater dialogue so that we could, kind of put these things in context and to be able to do so in a way that allows us to be in greater solidarity with one another. And people are doing that. And I want to put a shout out to Freedom Inc. In Minnesota as a
Uh-huh.
great example, right, of Black Asian solidarity around issues of police abuse and murders that are happening today.
I like that. I didn't know the history about the licensing for liquor. So what I did know is that actually the police, in an exercise that we became familiar with, and because we are so familiar, is not discussed, is that they actually severed like the exit of the neighborhood from like the Koreans towards like the white residential wealthier neighborhoods. So basically it was a kind of a trap, and that exacerbated the violence um, and the looting and the problems. Basically they were kind of sealed off, and that really kind of hit me in this instrumentalization of the minorities. The other element that you bring about that is very interesting is that and I like that you use the word solidarity and not alliance, because alliance leave us in instrumental relations as opposed to really building common basis for present and future action. But on those grounds, and on the grounds of affirmative action that could take place in the 60s vis-a-vis both education and labor, things that do not seem to be present today. On the contrary, there seem to be the competition, and we have this model of Amy Chua, because what she wrote about it, kind of the tiger mom, and it's this kind of liberal leaning on these model minority from the right idea of the personal success. And along those lines, the fact that, for example, the lower school in San Francisco had removed the competitive exam for this very good school, Chinese feel that, it's the discrimination against themselves, right? So why would they side with, those white liberals who are for equity? I mean, it's a real puzzle politically.
Yeah, I mean, I want to point out a couple of things. One is that the there's that Asians are often used, right, as the wedge. So in the case of the Harvard case, for example, there's a gentleman, it's a politically motivated lawsuit brought by this gentleman, his name is Edward Blum, and he created Bloom, and he created an organization called Students for Fair Admissions and recruited Chinese parents to be, so he's mobilizing Chinese parents to be part of the movement. And I think there's a lot of false, there are lots of myths that, those Chinese advocates bought into that are not true in terms of the way in which admissions takes place, looking at the whole person, and in ways that don't rely so much on test scores. And I think there's been a long history that shows that of research that shows that how test scores are culturally biased. And also that if you look at admissions at these elite universities, particularly private elite universities, that more slots go to legacy, right? People considered legacy students, students whose parents attended, whose parents may have donated to the university. Um, and if you take that proportion, right, then you could actually open the pool for many more minority or underrepresented students at those
Mhm.
universities. So it really um, skirts these bigger issues of that of why there aren't more Black, particularly Black, Latino, and Native students represented in these elite institutions.
Yes, definitely. It's like the invisible, like sealing off, like the white neighborhoods. I mean, that is taken as a given, right? And you focus on the in the tension um among
What,
groups.
right? Why do we have black and brown people fighting over admissions when actually why don't we all kind of unite and question the efficacy of these legacy admissions, for example?
Absolutely, absolutely. And the geographic distribution for the case of Harvard that doesn't involve, the Asian students. So when you said the title, the perpetual foreigner, the anti-Asian American hate, but we're leaving the last part, and we can do what we can do about it. So I want to focus, before we open it to questions, what we can do about it. um, there are efforts in legislation. I know you have very particular views about that I would like you to share. And also as an urban planner, right? What kind of recommendations you would make, both material and human recommendations, particularly in education, that has been a major area of your work, and it's very close to my heart as well.
Right. I'm a strong believer in public education, and I myself am a product of the LA Unified School District, the Cal State University system, and the University of California system, and worked at the University of Hawaii land grant institution for 22 years, and then returned to UCLA. And I truly believe that education is the cornerstone of an inclusive, democratic, um, equitable society. And if we're not included in the education, then people won't see us. And I think that is a major problem in the U.S. That Asian Americans are less than 6% of the U.S. population. We tend to be concentrated in larger metropolitan cities, though that's starting to change with more suburbanization of our communities and even migration to some of the rural areas. But we still have huge swaths of this country who don't interact much at all with Asian Americans. They don't know who we are. And that remains a huge problem. Or Pacific Islanders even less, right? So one of the things that our Asian American Studies Center is launching is a digital educational platform with free ethnic studies curricula for anybody. Um, so we're just starting to launch a digital Asian American Studies textbook project where we want to be able to have a free online textbook that any school, high school, or college can utilize. It's going to be scholar advised, so it'll be reflective of the latest in scholarship. So it's really interesting because Asian American studies as a field, like ethnic studies as a field that was born out of the student movement of the 1960s,
Mhm.
we've produced over 50 years of top-notch scholarship in our fields, but most of it lies behind the paywalls of publishers and university libraries.
Definitely.
So what we want to do is kind of democratize education by translating the scholarly works and scholarly books into the kinds of narrative language that any high school student, could understand and comprehend and
On,
engage with.
sorry, only for high school or K through 12 and college?
So we're starting with high school and college,
Uh-huh.
right?
Okay.
And I think we could write our effort to write a digital textbook um, right now is focused on upper high school,
Mm-hmm.
um, college level, but
Mm-hmm.
hopefully, ninth and 10th graders can access it as well. But we want to be able to take advantage of the latest in technology, educational technology, and understanding of online pedagogy so that teachers and students can really engage in these learning experiences that will be curated but really open to interpretation, interpretive exercises.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll have lesson plans and teacher guides and things like that, and archives even. We want to let students kind of dive into the archives so they could actually see the historical documents
Mm-hmm.
that surrounded particular moments in historical time.
I want to follow up on that. And what about legislation? I mean, there are conversations about putting out pieces of legislation that would address, anti um, Asian American hate at this particular juncture. And I know that you are very critical of that.
I'm not opposed to legislation that helps us monitor and track incidents because I think data can be very, very important for us
Mm-hmm.
to address a problem. What my concern is one, the thinking that um, hate crime legislation that increases penalties and broadens the definition of hate crimes so that there could be more greater prosecution of hate
Mm-hmm.
crime is leading us away from the actual solutions that we really need to get at to address the problem. So, for
Mm-hmm.
example, um, the Stop AAPI Hate Reporting Center recorded, over, I think, I can't remember, over 700 incidents in LA County, in a particular period of time. But uh, only 15 hate crimes were reported by the LAPD. So there's a big discrepancy, right, between because
Mm-hmm.
most of the incidents against Asian Americans during this period have not risen to the level of criminal behavior. So hate crime legislation captures just a very, very small fraction, right,
Mm-hmm.
of the cases that include physical assaults or serious threatening,
Mm-hmm.
serious threats and things like that. So, and then if you look at, uh, there are different groups of people that are committing hate crimes, and I'm afraid that, and it mirrors the population in those geographic areas, and I think, it skews towards lower income people, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so what you're going to do is increase penalties for more poor people, Black, brown folks, and it in certain ways goes against what the Black Lives Matter movement is trying to reach for. So I see some it's kind of a train wreck in slow motion in a way if we put all of our energies into that as a solution. Whereas I think there are so many things we can do in terms of education, of victim support, supporting victims, and
Mm-hmm.
for those people who do commit acts of aggression or crimes against Asian Americans, um, we need to figure out what's at the root of it and help solve that, right? If it,
Mm-hmm.
if it, if it whether it's racist attitudes or, I mean, we need to change some of the basic things that are leading to that. So,
Mm-hmm.
um, you know, how, for example, if you commit a sex crime, right? Then what part of the sentence is to go to these classes to try to deal with your behavior, right? So, and in some cases, right, that not so much sex crimes, but in terms of um, in certain countries where if you do attack somebody or you do assault somebody, then there's a process of reconciliation and apology and sentencing that, or not sentencing, but a process that you could engage in, right? To make amends, to ask for forgiveness, to receive
Mm-hmm.
forgiveness,
Mm-hmm.
and to kind of undo, right, some of the hurt and damage that was done. We don't have that kind of system here. We don't have a system that allows for reconciliation, restoration, healing, um, and reorienting, right? Reorienting our thinking.
No,
So
but yeah, I mean, we go back to the either or, right? To this like very dichotomical understanding, black and white, jail free, and punishment, no punishment. And this is what I see. Maybe I'm reading too much, but this kind of like human infrastructure that can kind of pay attention to what's going on in order to basically address issues that do not have to be police, because police hasn't been the solution ever. And trying to manage this social conflict in ways that don't exacerbate it, right, and are conducive, as you say, to a democratic society. A last very provocative question that I'm going to ask you is that there's this the Korean writer that you are familiar, but maybe the audience is not, Jay Caspian King. He writes for the New York Times. He wrote many controversial pieces, but in one of them he says the term Asian American is completely meaningless. Would you agree with that? Or what's the power of the term?
that's a really provocative question, and I appreciate it. I think the ways in which we describe ourselves, the ways in which we identify ourselves, um, are on one hand very personal, right? Who do we call ourselves? What do we call ourselves? What do I call myself? What groups do I identify with? It's a very intimately personal question. And then
Mm-hmm.
at the same time, we know that identities are race is a social construct, right? That there's not this kind of inherent biological difference that makes us necessarily different from somebody else, but we've lived very different experiences, right? And that's rooted in kind of the history of nationhood, of the kind of political economy, and now a growing globalized um, economy and political dynamics,
Mm-hmm.
and power dynamics, right? That take place. So I think the term Asian American is very meaningful to many people, right? At the individual level, and then I
Mm-hmm.
think at the at the global scale, um, I think it's been uh, Asian American and Pacific Islander um, are terms that we use, right, to denote certain things. So every label is given social meaning. And I
Mm-hmm.
think the social meaning surrounding Asian Americans, they're always tentative, right? These social meanings are always contested. They're always under debate. Um, and they're always fluid to certain degrees. But I think it's still a term that like that has still held up for different reasons. I think part of it is because there is still um, there are still commonalities in
Mm-hmm.
U.S. business and military exploits in
Mm-hmm.
Asia and Pacific,
Mm-hmm.
and that even though, but at the same time, there are differences, right? Pretty big differences between different Asian Americans who hearken from different national origins
Mm-hmm.
back in the past, and between those who are recent immigrants who still have a lot of active relationships, right, with
The
family
countries.
and
Mhm,
nations back home, versus those like myself. I'm third generation, and I can't even speak Japanese very well. So, um, but I think it's been constructed as a political term, and the the degree to which that political term holds a group of people together, that waxes and wanes. But I think in this period of anti-Asian hate, I think it's because anyone who looks East Asian, right? Um, and most of the people who have been attacked have been Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Southeast Asian, who um, versus South Asian or Pacific Islanders. Not that there haven't been those attacks, but in terms of like the large majority, um, because it's a phenotypical, right? If it's physiological, it's
mhm,
people make judgment based on how someone looks. That there's
mhm,
still something about that is relevant, right? That has resonance in American society today. The color of
mhm,
your skin still has
mhm,
has meaning for people, rightly or wrongly. And to the extent that
mhm,
it still does, that is one of the factors kind of holding at least, certain Asian American groups together,
mhm,
uh, as well as, people really making the effort to be inclusive, to build an inclusive tent. Um,
mhm. Definitely, yes. There's the individual kind of element of anchor of identity, and at this particular juncture, politically forging an unstable, complex, collective identity could be helpful to further visibilize something that has been invisible in very bad ways for way too long, right? So I'm being bad. I'm not late in general, even though I'm Argentine, but I'm late for the questions. So if you allow me, or if you have any further comment, yes. If not, I will move to the question. Karen, what do you think? Questions.
oh,
So
of course.
uh,
I've been looking
if
forward to the questions.
So the first question by Linda Allen. Like most of this audience, I'm fairly old. I'm also a third generation San Franciscan. I have lived with and I'm fairly aware of anti-Asian hate. Please move on to the subtitle of your talk, what we can do about it. This was earlier and you mentioned it if, and I'd like to add the word now. We don't have much time left. Can you give us 3 options? And then she says, um, every member of George Floyd's family thank all the people who protested on his behalf. The idea of allyship seems to be powerful. Do you have any ideas of how we can show up our allyship with the AAPI community here in San Francisco, where we have had so many horrific occurrences?
Yeah. And I
Good
appreciate
questions.
the, yeah, I appreciate the question coming from San Francisco. I graduated from SF State. I'm a Gator, so and I lived in the city and on the East Bay, so it's really close to home. And when I saw that viral video of the Chinese woman, that one really went viral. Who fought back, the attacker, um, really highlighted the problem that exists in the Bay, and in the city in particular. So I think I could come up with three things easily that we can do now. I think one is to support these efforts to get educational materials out to the schools, to create it and then get it out to the schools. So I know SF State's Asian American Studies Department has been active in creating curriculum and doing teacher training. So if you're there locally, we do that in LA, and other campuses are the Carlos Bulasan Center at UC Davis, and other institutes are trying to develop more curriculum materials. So I think supporting those efforts is one thing. I think a second thing is there are many organizations that are providing victim assistance and doing media campaigns to stop AAPI hate. I think public messaging to stop AAPI hate is really, really important. So I think, for example, Chinese for affirmative action in San Francisco is part of the Stop AAPI Hate Consortium. So they are amongst a number of organizations. I think there's an Asian um, Americans Advancing Justice, the Asian Legal Caucus, um, ALC up there doing victim assistance. So I think no matter where you are, there are local organizations that you can support in on both the messaging, public relations side. The Asian American Foundation is doing a big See Us campaign. And then cities are doing campaigns too. The LA City is doing LA for All, and LA County is doing LA versus Hate. So I think, um, supporting some of those local efforts is important. And then the third is that, many of us are part of organizations. We're part of churches, we're part of book clubs, we're part of, some of us who have kids or grandkids are part of schools. I think, especially for those, um, so part of it is thinking about within your sphere of influence, what can you do, right? So if your church or synagogue or temple, devotes some time to do these kinds of talks, presentations, dialogues about the problem, and then and think about ways that people can be more supportive of those being affected by it. I think that's one example of something that people can do in their own sphere. If you have children or grandchildren, nieces or nephews in school, in school, ask what textbook, look at the textbook, look at their history textbook, look for what is being taught about Asian Americans, and if Asian Americans history and culture and contributions and contemporary issues are even being taught in those textbooks, because that's where you could actually leverage, right, your voice and maybe organize other parents, right, to maybe consider textbooks that are more inclusive of our histories. Those are really concrete things that we can all do. And lastly, I think there, whether or not one has been directly affected by anti-Asian violence or hate or not. I know for me, I just got hate mail, you know, uh, in the mail, and I don't know if it's uh, because I've been speaking out a lot more. I think it's because I've been speaking out a lot more on the issue of anti-Asian hate.
Mhm.
Um, that I feel it directly, and I know some of my colleagues, one got Zoom bombed and got a death threat on his Zoom meeting immediately after the Atlanta shootings, and he's still shaken up by it. So there are those of us who are kind of dealing with it in a very direct, real way. But even for those who aren't, I think people are just feeling it because they know someone who's been affected, or they hear about it in the news, and they're not sure if they're going to be affected when they go out. So I think um, just giving people a listening ear, or giving people support, um, you know just acts of kindness and friendship, I think
Mhm.
really make a big difference.
Yeah, I really like that. I mean, more for that, for adults, what I see coming in terms of political economy and the rising place of China in the world economy. It's important to point, that that's an economic issue and doesn't have to be conflated with individual, human beings. As obvious as it can be, we have to be very alert to the subtlety of how people talk about these things and stop them like right on the spot. It requires huge alertness, right? um so let me ask Irene, Minabi. I hope I'm pronouncing the last name correctly. I tend to read in Spanish. What's the most effective forum for leaders from other ethnic groups to speak out about Asian hate acts, and how do we get them to do this? That's a good question. Thank you, Irene.
That's a good question. And if I had the answer, I'd be on it. I think that we have to speak up first. And I don't want to make assumptions, but I know Minabe is also a Japanese, not an uncommon Japanese last name. But if for those of us who are Asian American, we do have to speak up and be heard, because if we don't speak up, no one else is going to join us and speak up with us and beside, alongside us. That said, I think that issue points to this glaring problem of the bamboo ceiling, where we don't see a lot of Asian Americans, right, in positions of authority and decision making and in high profile positions. We don't even see many of us in the movies or in mass media. So let alone in high positions in government and governmental offices. So part of, I think, what we need to do is make sure that when people talk about diversity, right, that people include us, right, in the upper echelons of power making, and so that we can influence others, right, on an equal level, other people in positions of authority, to be able to take stronger stands, make deeper contributions, and to put their voice out there in more meaningful ways, right? Whether it's supporting the kinds of efforts that I mentioned earlier, or just changing some of these kind of structural problems, right, that lead to racial inequality and lack of understanding, empathy, and support for the smallest, and most marginalized of groups.
Yeah, I like the part of the, I like the answer, but I like the part of the answer, if I may put it in this term, if I know I will be doing it, it's sometimes is the question that we ask ourselves: what are the entry points of intervention that are, most effective at a particular juncture? And what I hear from you is that everything we can do to be alert and to visibilize, Asian American and Pacific Islanders is an effort of togetherness, right? And moving forward. And I want to apologize because I did not recognize the last name as a Japanese name. We have a few more minutes if someone wants to send a question. And also I want to invite everyone to sign up for the discussion session that we always have. But it occurred to me in this making invisible, one of my first experiences, if I may bring a personal anecdote, when I moved to the US, I was invited as a visiting fellow in New Jersey. And a friend of mine from secondary school was already living in the US. He had come for college. I came after college. And we were in an Italian restaurant in New Jersey. I'm sorry, I would never go back there, but anyways, we're in Italy. And so the waitress came and she just like stood looking at us, and we were speaking Spanish, Argentine Spanish, and she said, like, what language is that? And I said, Spanish. And she looked like, what? How come, like, he's speaking Spanish? Only at that second, I realized that my friend is Korean origin. He emigrated to Argentina with his family, and then he made it, to the US. And for me, it was completely normal, so to speak, that he his family came from Korea and he lived in Argentina, and then he came to the US. And this person could not place Korean Spanish in the US. And we had to explain that people move all over and they are, the way they moved here. For me, it gave me an entry point to the US understanding of things in a way that I couldn't have gotten, in a long time. I'm sorry, I'm self-indulging with this anecdote, but it allowed me to pay attention actually to, we don't know where these people is coming from, what people are coming from, they're, diverse, mobile, not pinhole. Karen, do you want to make a closing comment? Is there something that you would like to share that you haven't, that I didn't ask you? Apologies.
No, just maybe on a personal note. I think, and I could only speak for myself, but I know that this is a common feeling among many other Asian Americans that I know, and also Pacific Islanders. Like, as we grow up, we're taught not to stand out, right? It's a much more collectivistic culture that many of us come from. So to speak out is to call attention to oneself, which is not seen as a noble thing to do. And I think for my father, he always said that the nail that sticks up, right, is the one that gets hit. Because he was put in camp for being just Japanese and no other reason. So you want to kind of, stay low, hang low, and be as invisible as possible so nothing happens, nothing bad happens to you. So, and then on top of that, as a woman, my grandmother was a minister of a Konkokyo. It's a religion, more younger religion, a couple hundred years old in Japan, but she became a minister at age 72 and she lived to 105 and was probably one of the influential in my life. But the teachings that I grew, and she wanted me to be a minister too, and she would always share the teachings. And I remember one time there was one teaching about the role of a woman is to hold a fan and a mirror, a fan to hide your face and a mirror to reflect upon yourself. And so, those are the kinds of values that I grew up with. So it was very uncomfortable for me to speak up and speak out. And I still, that those habits, right, are really hard to break. And I think it's, so when I say, we have to stand up, we need to speak out. I also say that knowing how hard it is, right? What a challenge it is for us to do that. So I think it's helpful, people are thinking about ways they could be an ally or stand in solidarity to, help give us the courage and support, to speak our truth and do so in ways that, we want to do that in ways that benefit everybody. I mean, if you look at hate crimes nationally, Blacks are the most common victims of hate crime, well beyond their representation, in the general population. So there's more work to be done even if we talk about hate crimes, right? To protect others from hate crimes as much as we would, protect ourselves from hate crimes. So just like we're trying to build an Asian American Studies, right, digital textbook, I'd like to see an ethnic studies digital textbook in the long run that, ties more of our stories together so that we can tie, ourselves together as a society.
Yes, that's a beautiful note. I know that you're also digitalizing like a podcast on Asian Americans that is also going to be in the library. So you're doing like wide-ranging efforts of all the forms in technology and text and materials that can reach the widest, range of people, and to meet people where they are, whether they do technology, they do text. So that's an exercise of diversity and inclusion right there. Karen, I want to thank you very much for this very illuminating conversation in width and depth. And thank you for your work. I'll be checking your archives for materials for ethnic studies. And I wish you all the best. And I also want to thank everyone in the team who made this possible, and thank the audience and encourage the audience to sign up for the discussion group. Karen, thank you so much.
Thank you for a wonderful conversation, both of you. Thanks everyone for joining us. Take care.